Some serial murderers occasionally leave something behind after they murder a victim. Whenever a serial murderer leaves an item behind after the act, this is referred to in the literature as a signature. The signature is sometimes called a trademark or a calling card, and it reflects the compulsion on the part of criminals to go beyond just committing the crime to expressing themselves in some way that reflects their personality. It is often not enough for serial killers to merely consummate their murder. Rather, the killer must act out his fantasies and go beyond merely inflicting death-producing injuries. This acting out is the signature characteristic of the crime, which reflects a unique aspect of the killer's personality, which is played over and over again in fantasy. In TV thrillers and detective novels, serial killers always intentionally leave some type of item at the scene of the crime. Often in the world of fiction, this item tends to be quite substantial and becomes noticed rather quickly by investigators. However, in reality, police often will not find a killer's signature because of either decomposition or usually because the assailant does not want it to be found. Of course, there are those serial killers who do want their signatures to be found. Dennis Rader, better known as the BTK killer, had several signatures that went along with each of his kills. He even sent letters to the police. By leaving letters behind, Rader knew he would be credited with the kills, and also he'd be able to tell the actual story for the killings. He left behind his chosen name as well: bind them, torture them, kill them. And he abbreviated this phrase as BTK, a term that would stick with him for years to come. The BTK killer was consumed with getting credit for the murders he committed, and he went out of his way to make sure that the media and the police knew that they were connected. Dennis Rader even wanted his would-be victims to know who he was. For example, he once waited several hours for a female victim to come home. Fortunately, the woman did not come home. She was visiting her sister. To taunt this woman, Rader left a note which said, "Sorry I missed you," signed the BTK. In addition to leaving items at the crime scene, Rader also started doing drops, which included handwritten notes of the killings and also pictures of the actual acts. Dennis Rader also left a note in a book at the public library, hoping it would be found. Much to his dismay, it never was. Soon, Dennis Rader would begin to escalate his efforts to achieve fame and notoriety. In March of 2004, 13 years after committing his last murder, Dennis Rader began to crave the spotlight. So he began sending letters to the police, and Rader even included the driver's license of one of his victims from a 1986 murder he committed. Rader began corresponding regularly with the police, and they answered him through a daily paper. In his letters to police, Rader asked if his writings, if put on a floppy disk, could be traced or not. The police answered his question in a newspaper ad posted saying it would be safe to use the disk. On February 16, 2005, Rader sent a floppy disk to a local station, and a forensic analysis quickly determined that the disk had been used by the Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita, as well as a reference to the name Dennis. An internet search determined that a Dennis Rader was president of the church council. Rader was later arrested on February 25th. The BTK killer is not only an example of a signature killer, it also illustrates what is referred to in the literature as crime scene rhetoric, which is a form of ritual where the killer leaves words behind. Usually these messages fall into three categories: notes, wall writings, and messages carved or written on the body of a homicide victim. Notes are sometimes left at crime scenes and dump sites by the perpetrator, and their purpose is usually to taunt or insult law enforcement officials, the media, or the family members of victims. Sometimes crime scene rhetoric will attempt to justify a murder. Oftentimes it will be used to predict future crimes. For the serial killer, the disposal of the body signals that the killing process involving a particular victim is over. Once completed, the killer will often be in a psychological state of euphoria. He will often remain in this state as long as reality does not challenge his position of self-importance. Often the killer will take special care in the disposal of the body because this is when he is most vulnerable. Interestingly, it is not uncommon for the killer to intend for a body to be found. He might stage the victim's corpse. Staging occurs when a killer purposely alters the scene of the crime prior to the arrival of the police. Organized serial killers who tend to be socially competent, charismatic, with high levels of intelligence are more likely than disorganized killers to stage their victims. This is usually due to the fact that it obviously takes some mental ability on the part of the offender to realize that there is a need to change the crime scene in order to divert the investigation of the police. While staging is a subject that has long been a familiar topic in the area of serial murder, there are more recent developments which are only now being written about. For example, according to the literature, criminal profilers have recently discovered an interesting relationship between the use of duct tape in the background of an individual who kills strangers. It turns out that many offenders learn about the efficiency of using duct tape to bind victims from other offenders during their incarceration. During their time in prison, offenders are instructed by other offenders the manner in which duct tape should be applied. So when duct tape is used on a murder victim, it may be an indication that the perpetrator has either been in prison at some time or is a past or present member of a special services branch of the military. This is something that investigators are now taking note of anytime they encounter a murder where the suspect is unknown and the victim was subdued with duct tape. Researchers have found that victims of serial murderers often have a symbolic value for the killer. For instance, Ted Bundy preyed upon white female college students with a middle-class background, and he especially liked his victims to have long straight hair parted in the middle. He preferred for his victims to have this style of hair because it resembled the style of his ex-girlfriend who had rejected him. Ted Bundy's modus operandi evolved in an organization and in its sophistication over time, as is typical of serial murderers. The term modus operandi, by the way, is a Latin phrase approximately translated as method of operation. The term is used to describe someone's habits of working, particularly in the context of business or criminal investigations. Early on, Ted Bundy's MO consisted of forcible late-night entries followed by a violent attack with a blunt weapon on a sleeping victim. Some victims were sexually assaulted with inert objects. All were left as they lay unconscious or dead. As his methodology evolved, Bundy became progressively more organized in his choice of victims and crime scenes. He would employ various ruses designed to lure his victim to the vicinity of his vehicle where he had pre-positioned a weapon, usually a crowbar. In many cases, he wore a plaster cast on one leg or a sling on one arm, and sometimes he hobbled on crutches. Then he requested assistance in carrying something to his vehicle. At other times, he identified himself as a police officer or as a firefighter. Bundy was regarded as handsome and charismatic by his victims, traits he exploited to win their confidence. Once near or inside his vehicle, the victim would be overpowered, bludgeoned, and restrained with handcuffs. Most were sexually assaulted and strangled, either at the primary crime scene or, more commonly, after being transported to a pre-selected secondary site, often at a considerable distance away. Toward the end of his spree in Florida, perhaps under the stress of being a fugitive, he regressed to indiscriminate attacks on sleeping victims. Criminal profilers cannot always link homicides by an offender's modus operandi because, as the Ted Bundy case illustrates, the MO is dynamic and is always changing and evolving with experience. Crime is a learned behavior like any other type of behavior, and offenders will become more adept at murder with experience. Many profilers have found that one element that tends to be commonplace in stranger-on-stranger killings is the presence of a blindfold. Blindfolds can take many forms, ranging from masks to rags or simply pieces of cloth. One obvious reason for a blindfold is to hide the identity of the killer, but more often these may be used to further confuse or terrify the victim. Also, blindfolds may depersonalize and objectify the victim. This makes it easier for a killer to block out the personal nature of the crime, and for this reason a blindfold found at the crime scene does not necessarily mean that there was a personal relationship between the killer and his victim. Forensic psychologist Dr. Eric Hickey contends that many serial killers have a paraphilia or perhaps multiple paraphilias. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders published by the American Psychiatric Association, paraphilia is an erotosexual condition involving an obsessive dependence on an unusual stimulus, physical or fantasy, in order to achieve or maintain sexual arousal. In order for a behavior to be considered a paraphilia, the condition must last for a period of at least 6 months. Paraphilias tend to be found almost exclusively in males and are almost never found in women, though there are some exceptions. For example, hybristophilia is a rare type of paraphilia that is often referred to as the love of criminals. Interestingly, the literature indicates that females tend to be more likely to have this paraphilia than men. This might explain why there are some females who are attracted to serial murderers. In fact, if you look at all the serial killers who have been apprehended and convicted, you will find that many of them, maybe most in fact, have actually gotten married behind bars. Several serial murderers even have fan clubs of devoted females. It is important to point out that having a paraphilia does not automatically make someone a serial murderer. In fact, the vast majority of people with a paraphilia do not engage in murder. Also, a spectrum of paraphilia emerges as they range from those relatively benign to those extremely harmful to oneself or others. For example, a number of deaths have been attributed to autoerotic asphyxia, where persons experimenting for the first time or through miscalculations have accidentally killed themselves by hanging. Conversely, the desire to dress up in costumes or the urge to use pornography while having sexual relations does not physically harm anyone. Yet, the preference to secretly watch people undress or bathe often crosses lines of criminality. As you read about the various types of paraphilia, consider which ones are the most dangerous and which ones might be the most prevalent among serial murderers. As the readings suggest, most serial killers have an obsessive dependence on various bizarre fantasies and behaviors. Often, it is these very fantasies which might very well lead to an individual to commit murder.